Hello, everybody, and welcome to Knowledge 11, Lesson 2. This is about the Cumberland Gap and finding a space in that big barrier called the Appalachian Mountains. Now, a gap is something like when you lose a tooth, you have a gap between your teeth. That's what that empty space is called. And when you're looking at a mountain range that just keeps going, and then suddenly you see like the letter V, like as if somebody just chopped a little space in between. That's a gap. That obviously you won't have to climb the mountain to get over it. And the mountains down there are cliffs. So you can climb a mountain, but getting a wagon up a cliff would be quite a trick. So they were looking for an opening, a gap. And this is about Daniel Boone and getting through the Appalachian Mountains, okay? Now, before I start reading the story, I want you to understand that the world that they lived in back then looked a lot different from the one we live in now. The trees you're looking at, these are American chestnuts. And American chestnuts were the most common tree that Daniel Boone would have seen. And they were tremendous. They were bigger than any tree you have ever seen. Unless you were out in California recently, where they do have some trees that are bigger. But you have never seen a tree as big as an American chestnut tree, and they were everywhere. That's what you're looking at in these pictures. Look at the size of the person and compare that to the size of the chestnut tree. All right, well, those chestnut trees don't exist now. They all died because of a disease that was brought in about 120 years ago. And now you won't see any trees that big. Anyway, that's another story. Anyway, so listen to find out what happened during Daniel Boone's adventures as a trailblazer. A trailblazer? He's blazing a trail. That means he's the first one of many. Daniel Boone continued exploring the Appalachian Mountains, always on the lookout for a path that might lead him to the other side. One day he was visited by an old friend named John Finley. As the two men talked, Daniel told John of his desire to find a way to cross the mountains. To his great surprise, Finney replied, "Why, I know a way. I've crossed the Appalachians myself." He told Daniel that he knew of several big gaps in the mountains. Formed by rushing water years and years ago, the natural gaps or passes through the mountains had been trampled down first by buffalo and later by Native Americans. Now, a pass makes it easier to cross mountains by, you don't have to climb up a cliff. One pass was not too far from where Daniel Boone and his family lived. "It's in Virginia, and it's called the Cumberland Gap," Finley told him. "It is an old Native American footpath." That means you can only walk or ride a horse on a footpath. Boone was delighted. He asked John Finley to show him how to find it. Not long after that, the two men set off with 4 other men on a big adventure to find Cumberland Gap. They walked and rode on horseback for many miles before reaching the beaten path that led up a steep side of the mountain. They spent long days climbing up and up and up. Daniel's skills as a woodsman helped him identify animal tracks and follow the Native American footpath. They were overjoyed to reach the top of the mountain where they could see a magnificent river stretching out beneath them. Following a narrow footpath, the men finally made it to the other side of the Appalachian Mountains, to the land that is now known as Kentucky. Now, Kentucky is to the west of the Appalachian Mountains, so Daniel Boone made it to the other side. Daniel and his friends were pleased with what they found on the other side of the mountains. The land was beautiful. It was rich and fertile, and there were great herds of buffalo grazing on grasses. For the next 2 years, Daniel Boone stayed in eastern Kentucky, hunting and trapping wild animals. When he finally returned to North Carolina, he was met by other settlers who also expressed an interest in leaving their homes in the east and moving westward. These pioneers asked Daniel if he could show them the way across the Appalachian Mountains. And remember, a pioneer is one of the first people to live in a new place. "It's not an easy trip," Boone told them. "The forests are dense, and there are many, many dangers along the trail." But the pioneering spirit of these settlers remained strong. 2 years later, they convinced Daniel that they were serious about making the hard and dangerous trip to lands in the wilderness. And so, Daniel led his own family, along with a few other families, back through the Cumberland Gap into Kentucky. However, the trip proved even harder for families than it had been for the woodsmen. The families were not used to living in the wild outdoors like the woodsmen were. Setting up a settlement in Kentucky was more difficult than the pioneers expected, and they were forced to go back home over the Appalachian Mountains. How'd you like to cut down a chestnut tree with an old-fashioned saw? You saw how thick those trees are. Later, a businessman offered Daniel Boone a job to help widen some Native American trails that crossed the Appalachian Mountains. He wanted Daniel to make the trails wider and clearly marked so pioneers wouldn't lose their way as they crossed the mountains. Daniel Boone became known as a trailblazer. He helped to open up the way for pioneers to move west. Daniel Boone gathered together a group of men to help him clear the forest through the wilderness. Together they worked through snow, rain, and mud. They used axes to chop down trees and bushes to widen the old Native American footpaths so that the pioneers' wagons would fit. Remember, a footpath is only wide enough for walking or riding a horse, not wide enough for wagons. They built log bridges across streams. Daniel Boone and the men successfully cleared a trail from eastern Virginia through the Cumberland Gap and on into Kentucky. The trail was originally Native American footpaths called the Great Warrior's Path. Later it became known as the Wilderness Road. Pioneers from Virginia, North Carolina, and Pennsylvania began to move along the Wilderness Road in great numbers. And by that time, Kentucky was declared a state. Less than 20 years after the trail was widened, and more than 100,000 people had used the Wilderness Road. Daniel Boone's hard work was responsible for opening up the area known as the West to many pioneers. As more and more settlers streamed into the West, relationships with Native Americans who were already living there became even more strained. Now, Daniel Boone's own family was the first pioneer family to settle in Kentucky. Daniel chose a spot near the Kentucky River to build a fort. Well, who was he defending himself from? It took several years to complete the fort. About as large as one city block, the fort sheltered log cabins and the people that lived in them. The fort was named Boonesboro after Daniel Boone, the man who built it. Now, life was very difficult for the pioneers in the beginning, but people kept streaming across the mountains. In fact, so many people came that Daniel Boone felt that his wilderness was being destroyed. It was no longer a wilderness land. He never gave up his love for the wilderness and continued to explore lands west of Kentucky until his death at the age of 86. So Daniel Boone lived to a ripe old age, even though he had all of that hard living, sleeping out in the woods and chopping down gigantic chestnut trees and all the stuff that he had to deal with. But all that exercise, maybe that's why he made it to age 86, right? In the read aloud you heard, these pioneers asked Daniel if he could show them the way across the Appalachian Mountains. Say that word, pioneers. Pioneers are the first people to live in a new place. They often lead the way for others to follow. Many books have been written about pioneers settling the western part of the United States. Would pioneers have traveled long distances? Yes. Would pioneers build fires to keep themselves warm? Yes. Would pioneers have to shoot animals, wild animals for dinner? You bet. They did not have cities. They didn't have stores to go shopping in. They were the first people there. So everywhere they went was just wild. It was wilderness. Remember that word pioneers and try to use that sometime.